The end of the world doesn't always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrives quietly with the scratch of a pen on paper. November 11, 1918. A railway carriage in a French forest. The guns of World War I fall silent. For Germany, it's not just defeat, it's collapse. Complete, catastrophic, unexpected. For 4 brutal years, the German government had told its people they were winning. They'd financed the most expensive war in human history not with taxes, but with borrowed money, promising citizens that when victory came, the defeated enemy would foot the bill. But now Germany was the defeated enemy. The Kaiser fled to exile in Holland. The empire dissolved into revolution and street battles. Out of the ashes stumbled a fragile democracy nobody wanted, the Weimar Republic. This newborn government inherited a corpse. War debt was staggering. The economy was shattered. Millions of soldiers were streaming home from trenches, looking for jobs that didn't exist. But the real nightmare was just beginning in Paris at the peace conference. Versailles. The financial death sentence the victorious Allies, led by France, wanted revenge. Not just territorial adjustments or political concessions. They wanted to ensure Germany could never threaten them again. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just redraw borders, it drafted a financial execution order. Germany was forced to sign Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It accepted full, sole responsibility for the entire war. This wasn't just humiliation, it was the legal basis for reparations. The Allies demanded Germany pay for the entire cost of the war. The final figure, 132 billion gold marks. The number was so astronomical it was meaningless. It wasn't designed to be paid. It was designed to crush the German economy for generations. Here's the critical detail. Reparations had to be paid in gold or foreign currency, US dollars, British pounds. The Allies refused German paper money. They knew exactly what was coming. The French were particularly vindictive. They remembered 1871, when Prussia had defeated France and imposed harsh terms. This was payback, with interest. Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau wanted Germany broken permanently, unable to ever wage war again. The British were more pragmatic but still demanded their share. They'd borrowed heavily from America and needed German payments to service their own war debts. It was a pyramid scheme of international debt, with Germany at the bottom. The Americans, represented by President Woodrow Wilson, pushed for leniency, but they were outvoted. Wilson's idealistic 14 points were largely ignored. The treaty that emerged was punitive, vindictive, and economically unsustainable. The impossible choice, the Weimar government faced an impossible dilemma. They needed massive amounts of money to pay crushing reparations, fund pensions for millions of wounded veterans and war widows, rebuild a shattered economy, and keep a fragile democracy from collapsing. A strong government might have raised taxes dramatically or confiscated wealth from aristocrats and war profiteers who'd gotten rich while soldiers died. But the Weimar government wasn't strong. It was terrified. The Russian Revolution had just happened. Communist uprisings were breaking out across Germany. Taxing the rich too heavily might trigger civil war. Taxing workers too heavily might spark revolution. The government was caught in a vice. The Spartacist League, German communists, had already attempted a coup in January 1919. Revolutionary leader Rosa Luxemburg was murdered by right-wing paramilitaries called the Freikorps. Street fighting between communists and nationalists was tearing cities apart. In this environment of chaos and violence, asking people to tighten their belts and pay heavy taxes to fund reparations to foreign powers seemed like political suicide. So they chose the path of least resistance, the path politicians have chosen throughout history when facing insurmountable debt. They turned on the printing presses. The slow descent at first, it didn't seem catastrophic. During the war, Germany had already abandoned the gold standard. In 1914, $1 bought about 4 German marks. By war's end in 1918, a dollar bought 8 marks. Inflation was already there, eating away at wages. But it was manageable. Life was hard but functional. The government printed money to pay domestic bills, salaries for teachers, police, bureaucrats. They used this freshly printed paper to buy foreign currency to pay reparations. Throughout 1919 and 1920, the presses ran a little faster each month. As more paper marks flooded the system, their value decreased. So the government had to print even more to buy the same amount of gold or foreign currency, a slow downward spiral. By 1921, the exchange rate slipped to 60 marks per dollar, then 90, then 300. German prices started rising noticeably. Bread became more expensive every few months. Savings accounts that took lifetimes to build bought less and less. There was grumbling in beer halls and bread lines. But there was still faith in the currency. A mark was still a mark. People still believed the government would eventually get things under control. The government tried negotiating, begging the Allies for a moratorium, a pause in payments so the economy could recover. The British were sympathetic, realizing a bankrupt Germany couldn't buy British goods. British economist John Maynard Keynes had already warned that the reparations were economically insane. But France was adamant. They'd borrowed heavily from America and needed German payments to service their own debts. They wanted their money, or they wanted blood. The occupation of the Ruhr by late 1922, Germany missed a delivery, telegraph poles and coal, part of reparations payments. A minor default. Some historians argue it was barely even a default, more of a delay, but France used it as pretext. French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré decided if Germany wouldn't pay, France would take payment by force. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into Germany, not toward Berlin, but toward the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr was Germany's industrial heart. Coal mines, steel mills, factories powering the entire nation. The region produced 85% of Germany's coal and 80% of its steel. Without the Ruhr, the German economy couldn't function. France's plan was simple. Occupy the mines and factories, seize coal and steel directly, ship it back to France as reparations. It was an act of war in peacetime. The international community was shocked, but no one stopped France. Britain protested but did nothing. America, increasingly isolationist, looked the other way. The German army, reduced to a glorified police force of 100,000 men by Versailles, could do nothing. The German government was outraged but powerless. They couldn't fight militarily, so they decided to fight economically. They launched the most expensive act of defiance in history: passive resistance. The fatal decision: Berlin ordered a policy of passive resistance. They told coal miners, steel workers, and railway workers in the Ruhr, stop working, down tools, don't dig a single lump of coal for the French. General strike. A wave of patriotic fervor swept the region. The industrial heart of Europe stopped beating. French soldiers found themselves guarding silent factories and empty mines, massive industrial complexes standing idle, wheels not turning, furnaces going cold. The French tried bringing in their own workers, but they lacked expertise and local knowledge. They tried forcing German workers at gunpoint, but productivity was nearly zero. You can force a man to show up at a mine, but you can't force him to mine efficiently or safely. Some German workers who collaborated with the French were branded traitors. There were incidents of sabotage. Tensions escalated. French soldiers shot and killed several German protesters. The occupation became increasingly bitter and violent. But there was a massive problem with passive resistance. Millions of workers in the Ruhr weren't working. If they weren't working, they weren't getting paid. How would they eat? How would their families survive through winter? The German government made a promise. Berlin would pay the wages of every single striking worker in the Ruhr. They'd pay millions of people to do nothing, just to spite the French, just to prove a point about national dignity. It was a grand gesture. It was politically popular. It was economically suicidal. Where would the money come from to pay millions of idle workers week after week, month after month? The printing presses in Berlin roared to life. They weren't printing a little extra anymore. They were about to unleash a financial tsunami that would drown the entire nation. Into the abyss. The hyperinflation begins. The decision to pay striking Ruhr workers with printed money was the spark that ignited the inferno. Before 1923, Germany had high inflation. After January 1923, they entered hyperinflation, the realm of madness. It was the perfect economic storm. On one side, the government pumped billions of new paper marks into the economy weekly to pay strikers. The money supply exploded. On the other side, because the Ruhr had stopped working, the supply of actual goods collapsed. Coal production stopped. Steel production stopped. Manufacturing ground to a halt. Vast amounts of new money chasing fewer and fewer goods. The result: instant, catastrophic price increases. Basic economic laws asserted themselves with brutal vengeance. As soon as new paper hit the streets, shopkeepers knew it was worth less than yesterday's money. So they raised prices. Workers, seeing prices rise, demanded higher wages to buy food. The government, desperate to keep peace and maintain the strike, printed more to pay those higher wages. The vicious cycle spun faster and faster, accelerating beyond anyone's control. In January 1923, $1 bought 18,000 marks. By April, 24,000. By June, 100,000. The currency began losing its function as a store of value. If you held a mark for a week, it lost half its purchasing power. By summer, holding money for even a day was financial suicide. This changed human behavior instantly and fundamentally. The flight from currency, a new phenomenon emerged that economists would study for decades. The flight from currency. As soon as people got paid, they ran. Literally ran to the nearest store to buy anything. Didn't matter if you needed shoes, potatoes, or nails. You bought them because they were physical objects that held value, whereas paper in your pocket rotted by the hour. Workers would line up at factory gates on payday, and as soon as they received their pay envelopes, now bulging with increasingly worthless paper, they'd sprint to nearby shops. Employers started paying workers multiple times per day just so they could buy food at lunch. Shopkeepers learned to update prices multiple times per day, sometimes hourly. They'd calculate prices based on how long ago they'd purchased inventory. Some kept exchange rate charts behind the counter, adjusting prices based on the latest dollar mark rate. The velocity of money, the speed cash moves through the economy, hit warp speed. Money became a hot potato. Nobody wanted to hold it for more than minutes. Restaurants started listing prices on chalkboards instead of printed menus because prices changed too fast. Some establishments stopped listing prices altogether. They'd tell you the price when you asked for the bill, calculating based on the current exchange rate at that exact moment. By summer 1923, the numbers became absurd. The government couldn't print notes fast enough. The Imperial Printing Office ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, employing tens of thousands just to cut and stack paper. The printing office became one of the few growth industries in Germany. They needed more workers, more machines, more paper, more ink. It was a factory of madness, churning out worthless promises by the ton. They started outsourcing. Soon over 130 private companies across Germany were churning out banknotes. Cities and even private companies started issuing their own emergency currency, not Geld, because there literally wasn't enough official money, even though they were printing it as fast as humanly possible. They couldn't design new plates fast enough to keep up with zeros. So they came up with shortcuts, taking old 1,000 mark notes and stamping 1 million over the old number in red ink. Then 1 billion, then 1 trillion. The exchange rate plunged into the abyss. July 1923, $1 equals 350,000 marks. August 1923, $1 equals 4.6 million marks. September 1923, $1 equals 100 million marks. The banking system broke down. Banks didn't have vault space for the physical volume of paper needed for everyday transactions. A simple withdrawal might require wheelbarrows full of bills. People carried money in backpacks, then suitcases, finally wheelbarrows. There's a famous dark joke from this time. A man left his wheelbarrow full of money outside a bakery while he went inside. When he came back, someone had dumped all the money on the street and stolen the wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow was real wealth. The paper was trash. Society tears apart. The social fabric of Germany began shredding, thread by thread. The hardest hit were those who'd done everything right. The middle class, the savers, the pensioners. These were people who embodied traditional German values: thrift, hard work, planning, responsibility. People who'd worked 40 years and carefully saved for retirement watched their entire life savings vanish in weeks. Not slowly, not gradually. In weeks. A bank account that could have bought a comfortable house in 1921 couldn't buy a postage stamp by late 1923. Imagine being 65 years old, having saved diligently your entire working life, having a nest egg that represented security and dignity, and then watching it become literally worthless. Not diminished, not reduced, completely, utterly worthless. Widows living on fixed war pensions starved. Their husbands had died defending Germany and the government had promised to care for them. Those promises, denominated in marks, became cruel jokes. Landlords who'd rented properties on long-term leases found monthly rent payments wouldn't buy a single egg. Contracts written just months earlier became absurd. A rent payment of 1,000 marks per month had seemed generous in 1922. By late 1923, it wouldn't buy a box of matches. But while the prudent were punished, the gamblers were rewarded. It was a complete inversion of traditional morality. Borrowers wiped out debts for pennies. If you'd borrowed 5 million marks in 1922 to buy a factory, a huge sum, by summer 1923, you could pay off that entire loan by selling a single teacup. Industrialists and speculators who understood what was happening borrowed massive amounts of paper to buy real assets: land, mines, machines, entire factories, knowing they'd repay loans later with worthless money. Men like Hugo Stinnes, the inflation king, built industrial empires essentially for free, buying bankrupt competitors with borrowed paper that cost nothing to repay. Stinnes at his peak controlled roughly 20% of German industry: coal mines, steel mills, newspapers, shipping companies, hotels, all acquired during hyperinflation by exploiting the gap between real assets and paper money. The rich got obscenely rich. The middle class fell into poverty. The working class fell into desperation. Society turned completely upside down. Traditional values, hard work, thrift, planning, delayed gratification, were exposed as cruel jokes. Why work a 12-hour day when your entire week's wages wouldn't buy a tram ticket home? Why save for tomorrow when money lost half its value overnight? Crime exploded. Farmers guarded potato fields with shotguns as desperate city dwellers streamed out to steal food. There were reports of people being killed over a bag of potatoes or a chicken. Barter returned. Germany, one of the world's most sophisticated industrial economies, reverted to medieval trading. Doctors were paid in sausages and coal. Teachers accepted food as payment for lessons. Needles and thread became more valuable than stacks of 1,000-mark notes. A spool of thread could be traded for essential goods. Paper money couldn't. Prostitution soared to levels never seen before. Middle-class women with no other options turned to sex work to feed their families. The Berlin of the early 1920s became infamous worldwide for its desperate decadence. A society where everything was for sale because money meant nothing and survival meant everything. Foreign tourists, particularly Americans and British with hard currency, could live like kings. $1 could buy luxury that would have cost thousands before the war. This created bizarre scenes: wealthy foreigners dining in expensive restaurants while Germans starved outside, clutching worthless bundles of paper. The numbers lose all meaning by September 1923. The slide became freefall. The exchange rate hit 100 million marks per dollar. Berlin was losing control of the country, losing control of reality itself. Communist uprisings broke out in Hamburg and Saxony, armed workers seizing control of city districts. Separatist movements flared in the Rhineland. The French were still in the Ruhr. The printing presses were literally melting down from continuous operation. Winter was coming, and Germany had no coal because the Ruhr wasn't working. By autumn 1923, Germany entered the realm of the surreal. The numbers lost all connection to reality, to human comprehension. October 1923, $1 equals 25 billion marks. November 1923, $1 equals 4.2 trillion marks. Think about that number. 4.2 trillion, it's a number so large it's meaningless. The human brain can't process it. A trillion is a million millions. 4 trillion is nothing, infinity, absurdity. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. A single egg cost 80 billion marks. Prices weren't rising by the month or week anymore. They were rising by the hour, sometimes by the minute. There's a famous anecdote that captures this madness. A man walked into a cafe in Berlin and ordered coffee. The price on the menu was 5,000 marks. He sat down, drank his coffee slowly, enjoyed a moment of relative normalcy. 30 minutes later, when the waiter brought the bill, the price was 8,000 marks. The currency had depreciated by 60% in the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. Workers demanded to be paid not weekly, not daily, but twice daily. Employers would pay wages at lunch so workers could buy food before afternoon prices doubled. Some factories started paying 3 times per day. Wives would meet their husbands at the factory gates at lunchtime, take sacks of cash, and literally sprint, to the nearest shops to buy anything edible before prices rose again. The physical reality of the money became nightmarish. The notes were just paper. They had no intrinsic value. A 100 billion mark note was just ink on paper, paper that was probably worth more than the number printed on it. People began using money for anything other than commerce. The winter of 1923 was bitterly cold. Coal was scarce because of the French occupation of the Ruhr. People looked at stacks of billion-mark notes piling up in their homes, money they'd been paid but couldn't spend fast enough, and realized those notes couldn't buy coal. So they did the only logical thing. They threw the money into the stove. It was literally cheaper to burn stacks of cash for heat than to use that cash to try to buy firewood. Children used bundles of banknotes as building blocks. Others cut them up to use as toilet paper, drawer liners, or insulation. People wallpapered entire rooms with worthless bills, not as decoration, but because the paper had more value as wallpaper than as currency. The German mark, once a symbol of imperial strength and stability, was literally garbage. Cheaper than garbage, actually. At least garbage didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. Psychological devastation, the psychological impact was catastrophic. A collective trauma that would scar an entire generation and reshape German political culture for decades. A functioning society relies fundamentally on trust in the future. Money is a contract with tomorrow. It's a promise. You work today, you save today because you must believe, that the money you earn will be worth something tomorrow, next week, next year. When that trust vanishes, when the future becomes unpredictable and terrifying, civilization itself begins to revert to a primal state. Desperation set in like a fog. The death rate among infants and the elderly soared due to malnutrition and lack of heating. Tuberculosis spread through crowded, unheated tenements where families huddled together for warmth. Suicide rates spiked dramatically. People who saw their entire existence invalidated, who could not feed their children despite working themselves to exhaustion, who watched everything they'd built dissolve into worthless paper. They simply gave up, jumped from bridges, took poison, turned on the gas. The newspapers, when they could afford to print, carried stories of elderly couples committing suicide together rather than face starvation, of mothers killing their children before killing themselves, of veterans who'd survived 4 years of trenches deciding they couldn't survive the peace. This was Germany in 1923. This was what hyperinflation did to a civilized, industrial, educated nation. The beer hall putsch and salvation. By November 1923, the situation was terminal. The government could not continue. The entire system was collapsing. On November 8, Adolf Hitler decided the moment had come. In a Munich beer hall packed with local officials, he fired a pistol into the ceiling and declared a national revolution, the beer hall putsch. It was dramatic, theatrical, also incredibly poorly planned. Hitler intended to march on Berlin and seize power, mimicking Mussolini's successful march on Rome the year before. He thought the army and police would join him once he demonstrated strength and will. He was wrong. The next day, when the Nazi column marched through Munich, Bavarian police opened fire. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers were killed. The crowd scattered. Hitler fled, dislocating his shoulder. He was arrested 2 days later and charged with high treason. The immediate threat of a Nazi takeover was crushed. Hitler's movement seemed finished. But while the political coup failed spectacularly, the economic crisis had reached its absolute limit. The printing presses physically could not print zeros fast enough. Workers were exhausted. Paper supplies were running low. The machines themselves were breaking down. The entire economic machinery of a modern industrial nation had ground to a complete, total halt. Germany was on the brink of total disintegration, not just economic, but political, social, perhaps even territorial. Parts of the country were in open rebellion. The center could not hold. Something had to change instantly, radically, or the country would cease to exist as a coherent nation. In the darkest hour of November 1923, with Hitler in jail and the economy clinically dead, a new government took charge. It was led by pragmatic Chancellor Gustav Stresemann. Stresemann understood that to save Germany, he had to do deeply unpopular things. He had to stop the bleeding, even if it meant cutting off limbs. His first move was political and bitter. He called off passive resistance in the Ruhr. He told striking workers to go back to work, to submit to French occupation. It was national humiliation, an admission that France had won. Nationalists screamed traitor. But Stresemann knew, with absolute clarity, that the country could not survive if it continued paying millions to do nothing while industry stayed idle. His second move was financial and radical. He brought in Hjalmar Schacht, a brilliant and arrogant financial wizard, to perform surgery on the dying currency. Schacht knew immediately that the paper mark was beyond saving. Trust was gone. You couldn't just stop the presses and expect people to suddenly start using marks again. The currency was dead. It needed a funeral and a replacement. They needed a new currency. But what would back it? Germany had no gold. The Allies had taken it. The Reichsbank's vaults were essentially empty, so Schacht performed what can only be described as a psychological magic trick. On November 15, 1923, Schacht introduced the Rentenmark. He announced this new currency was backed not by gold, Germany had none, but by the real estate and agricultural land of Germany itself. The government took out a theoretical mortgage on every farm, every factory, every piece of property in the entire nation to back the new notes. Economically, this was smoke and mirrors. If the currency failed, the government couldn't actually seize every farm and sell it. The logistics would be impossible. The political backlash would be catastrophic. But psychologically, it was brilliant. It worked. The German people, desperate for anything stable, desperate to believe in something, chose to believe in the Rentenmark. They wanted it to work. They needed it to work, so they decided it would work. Schacht set the exchange rate with brutal simplicity. One new Rentenmark equaled 1 trillion old paper marks. 1 trillion. All those billions and trillions compressed down to one. But here's what made it actually work. Schacht did the one thing every previous government had refused to do, the thing that would have required courage and discipline from the very beginning. He stopped the printing presses. Completely. Absolutely. He declared that the supply of Rentenmarks was strictly limited. The government could no longer simply print money to pay its bills. If the government didn't have tax revenue, it couldn't spend. Period. It was brutal shock therapy. The government slashed spending. They fired roughly 25% of all civil servants, hundreds of thousands suddenly unemployed. They raised taxes sharply. They cut benefits and pensions. It was painful, harsh, but necessary. And then something remarkable happened. Something that seemed almost miraculous after the nightmare of the previous months. The hyperinflation stopped. Just stopped. Almost overnight, prices stabilized. The dizzying spiral halted. Food began reappearing in shops because farmers were suddenly willing to trade their produce for money that would still be worth something tomorrow. The wheelbarrows disappeared from the streets. People could carry money in their pockets again in reasonable amounts. The fever had broken. The patient was alive. Germany entered a period historians call the Golden Twenties. American banks, seeing stability return, began lending massive amounts under the Dawes Plan. This flood of American capital helped Germany make reparations payments and funded a remarkable economic recovery and cultural boom. Berlin became the cultural capital of Europe, famous for its avant-garde art, cabarets, jazz clubs, experimental theater. Scientists like Einstein worked there. Architects like Walter Gropius built there. Writers like Bertolt Brecht wrote there. For a few years, it seemed like the Weimar Republic had survived, like democracy had weathered the storm, like the worst was over. But that was an illusion. The final lesson, the Weimar hyperinflation, is one of history's great horror stories. Not because of the numbers themselves, though the numbers are staggering, but because of what those numbers did to people, what they did to society, what they made possible. It took a sophisticated, educated, industrial nation and reduced it to desperate chaos in a matter of months. It took a functioning democracy and made it despised. It took a middle class that believed in order and progress and left them destitute and radicalized. And the worst part, it was completely avoidable, self-inflicted, a choice. At multiple points, German leaders could have made different decisions, painful decisions, unpopular decisions, but decisions that would have preserved their democracy and their society. They didn't. They chose the easy path every time. They chose the printing press over hard choices, and the printing press destroyed them. That's the lesson that echoes across a century to our own time. Money is not just an economic tool. It's a social contract. It's a promise about the future. It's trust made tangible. Break that trust and you don't just break the economy, you break everything. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand how economies rise and fall, how wealth is created and destroyed, and what history's greatest cautionary tales teach us about our own time, make sure to subscribe. These patterns repeat, and understanding them might be the most valuable knowledge you can possess. We'll see you in the next one.